As I stood in the sterile hospital room, my mother's frail figure lay unconscious, and it hit me. I was the only one who truly cared. My brother Mark, thousands of miles away, posted empty platitudes on social media about family and love, while I sacrificed my career to become my mother's primary caregiver. I felt the familiar rush of resentment as I recalled how he always played the favorite son, leaving me to handle the mess. Growing up, I was always the one who had to pick up the pieces when things went wrong. Mark got to live his life, pursuing his dreams and enjoying his freedom, while I was stuck with the fallout of our mother's choices. Now, with her health declining and the mounting medical bills, I knew I had to act fast. The clock was ticking, and I had to confront the truth before it was too late. I had spent the last few months balancing my job and caring for her, managing doctor's appointments, medication schedules, and those endless hospital visits. The responsibility felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I kept thinking about how Mark would never understand the emotional and financial toll this was taking on me. Every time I reached out to him for support, he'd respond with some vague promise or a quick excuse. It was always the same story. I could already hear his dismissive tone in my head, as he spoke about how busy he was with his life, as if I wasn't drowning in my own. It felt like I was in this fight alone, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on. As I glanced at my mother lying there, I felt a surge of determination. I was done being the one who cared more. I was tired of being the one who always picked up the slack while he enjoyed life without a second thought. I would confront Mark and hold him accountable for his actions. I knew it was time to put an end to the favoritism and the manipulation that had defined our family dynamic for far too long. Mark had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our mother's eyes. Growing up, I watched as he effortlessly glided through life, receiving praise and admiration from our mother, while I was often left in the shadows. I can still recall the countless times I felt the sting of her words, the subtle digs about my career choices. "Why can't you be more like Mark?" she would say, her voice dripping with disappointment. It was like a knife to my heart, and I learned to suppress my feelings, to hide my resentment behind a forced smile. The family dynamic was clear. I was expected to take care of everything while Mark enjoyed his freedom. He never had to worry about responsibilities. He was off living his life, traveling and pursuing his dreams. Meanwhile, I was stuck picking up the pieces, managing my mother's care alone. It was a role I had been forced into, and I was tired of being the one who bore the burden of our family's dysfunction. When I became my mother's primary caregiver, it felt like I was stepping into a role that was predetermined for me. I juggled doctor's appointments, medication schedules, and all the endless hospital visits. Each day bled into the next, with no time for myself, no space to breathe. I watched as the financial burden grew heavier. Her treatment costs were astronomical, over $10,000 each month. I felt like I was drowning in bills, and I was terrified I wouldn't be able to keep up. I often thought about reaching out to Mark, hoping he might finally step up and help, but deep down, I knew what his response would be. Empty promises and judgment. Whenever I needed assistance, he'd vanish, leaving me to deal with our mother's illness alone. It was as if he was allergic to responsibility, thriving only in the comfort of his own life while I struggled under the weight of our family's expectations. I had come to expect his dismissiveness, but that didn't make it any easier. The few times I bravely asked for help, he'd respond with a quick excuse or a nonchalant answer that left me feeling even more isolated. "I can't right now, Jess. I have work commitments," he'd say, or worse, "You're doing such a great job. I'm sure you've got it covered." Those words felt like a slap in the face, a reminder that I was expected to handle everything while he was off living his best life. As I faced the mounting costs alone, I steeled myself for the inevitable pressure to ask Mark for help. I knew he wouldn't offer genuine support. He'd likely just criticize my choices or make me feel guilty for needing anything from him. The thought of reaching out made my stomach turn. But I also knew I couldn't carry this burden forever. The resentment simmered beneath the surface, and I felt it creeping in every time I looked at my mother, helpless in her hospital bed. I wanted to scream at the injustice of it all. Why was I the one sacrificing my career, my sanity, while Mark got to enjoy the perks of being the favorite son? I felt anger, frustration, and a deep yearning for recognition of my sacrifices. It was exhausting to be the one who always cared more. It was in that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the beeping machines and the sterile smell of antiseptics, that I realized I had to confront Mark. I was tired of being the one who always picked up the pieces. I was determined to hold him accountable for his actions, to expose the favoritism that had plagued our family for so long. No more would I sit idly by while he lived his life without a second thought for the sacrifices I was making. I had to take a stand, and I knew it would be messy and uncomfortable, but I was ready. The truth needed to come out, and I was ready to confront the reality of our toxic family dynamic. One late evening, while sifting through my mother's bank statements, I stumbled upon a shocking revelation. Mark had been siphoning money from her account, redirecting over $5,000 to his own. I felt my stomach drop as I realized he was exploiting our mother's illness for his gain. I could hear his laughter echoing in my mind as I imagined him flaunting his lifestyle while I toiled under the weight of our mother's care. The betrayal was unbearable. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the trust, the very foundation of our family that he was willing to destroy for his own selfishness. I could hardly breathe as I pieced together the timeline. The withdrawals had started shortly after our mother's diagnosis, right around the time I had taken on the burden of her care. It was sickening to think he had been so calculated, using her vulnerability to line his pockets while I was left to handle the fallout. At that moment, I felt a surge of anger and determination. I couldn't just let this slide. This was no longer about me being the responsible daughter or the caregiver. It was about standing up against the manipulation and exploitation that had plagued our family for years. How could he do this? How could he look himself in the mirror knowing he was robbing our mother, while I was sacrificing everything for her? I decided it was time to confront him. Not in private but in front of everyone. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I couldn't let him get away with this. I had to expose him and make sure the rest of the family knew the truth. I could already envision the shocked expressions on their faces as I revealed his deceit. The thought of it made my heart race. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that I was doing this for my mother, for the woman who had spent her life caring for us. I was tired of being the one who always cleaned up the mess, the one who was expected to take the high road while Mark continued to play the victim. No more. I had to be brave, I had to take a stand. As the days passed, I started imagining the confrontation in my mind. I rehearsed what I would say, how I would deliver the news. Would he deny it? Would he try to turn the tables and make me feel guilty? I knew my family would likely rally around him, as they always had, but this time would be different. I had proof, and I was determined to show them who he really was. The family gathering was approaching, and I felt a mix of fear and adrenaline. I knew I had to be ready. The moment I stepped into that room, I would confront him. I could already picture the looks of disbelief on everyone's faces as I laid out the truth. That night I barely slept. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. I was scared, but I was also filled with a sense of purpose. I had reached a breaking point. I refused to let him continue to manipulate me or our family. I would not be silenced any longer. When the day finally arrived, the atmosphere was charged with tension. As the family settled in, I felt my heart pounding. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. I could see Mark across the room, laughing and joking, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. I waited for the right moment, and when a lull in the conversation arrived, I stood up. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to me. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, but I pressed on. I need to talk to everyone about something serious. Mark, I know what you've been doing. You've been stealing money from Mom's account. Over $5,000. How could you? The gasps echoed in the room, and I saw Mark's face turn pale. I pressed on, feeling a rush of confidence. While I've been here, caring for her, managing everything, you've been exploiting her illness for your own gain. This has to stop. Mark's reaction was immediate. He scoffed, trying to brush it off. That's ridiculous, Jess. You're just trying to make me look bad. I can't believe you'd accuse me of that. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the way he shifted uncomfortably at the accusation. I continued, unwavering. You can't deny it, Mark. The bank statements don't lie. You need to be held accountable for your actions, and if you don't stop this now, I'll cut you out of our mother's life completely. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. I could sense the disbelief and tension in the room as the family processed what I had just revealed. I had finally taken a stand and I wouldn't back down. The next family gathering was my opportunity. As I walked into the room, I felt a mix of dread and determination. I could see Mark across the room, laughing and joking with our relatives, completely unaware of the storm about to hit him. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that this was for my mother and for me. It was time to confront him. When the moment felt right, I cleared my throat, and all eyes turned to me. I need to talk to everyone about something serious. Mark, I know what you've been doing. You've been stealing money from Mom's account. Over $5,000. How could you? My voice trembled, but I stood firm. Gasps filled the room, and I saw Mark's expression shift from amusement to shock. He opened his mouth to deny it, but I pressed on. While I've been here, caring for her, managing everything, you've been exploiting her illness for your own gain. This has to stop. The tension was palpable. Family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing between us as I laid out the facts. I had the bank statements, the evidence of his deceit, and I was ready to use it. Mark scoffed, attempting to regain control of the situation. That's ridiculous, Jess. You're just trying to make me look bad. I can't believe you'd accuse me of that. His voice dripped with indignation, a thin veil over the panic that was creeping in. I pressed forward, unyielding. You can't deny it, Mark. The bank statements don't lie. You need to be held accountable for your actions, and if you don't stop this now, I'll cut you out of our mother's life completely. You'll have no say in her care or her finances. You've made it clear that you only care about yourself, and I refuse to let you manipulate this family any longer. His reaction was immediate. He looked around the room, his eyes darting between the family members, searching for support. But instead of sympathy, he was greeted with disbelief. I could see the gears turning in their heads as they processed what I had just revealed. How could you let this happen? One relative finally spoke up, directing the question at Mark. The shift in the room was palpable as family members began to question his motives. I felt a surge of triumph. I was finally free from the burden of their expectations, and Mark was left to face the consequences of his actions. Mark's face turned red with anger, but I remained calm. I had finally taken a stand. The facade he had carefully built began to crumble, and I could see the cracks forming in his defense. You're ruining everything, he yelled, his voice rising in anger. You're making Mom's illness about you. It was the same tired tactic he always used, turning the tables and framing me as the villain. But this time I wouldn't let it work. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of my family members. They were seeing him for who he really was, and it was a moment of validation for me. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as I realized I had finally broken free from the cycle of manipulation. Mark continued to lash out, but I stood firm, refusing to engage with his anger. I wouldn't let him drag me back into the chaos he thrived on. Instead, I turned my attention back to the family, making sure they understood the gravity of the situation. This isn't just about money. It's about trust and family. We have to protect Mom. I've been here every step of the way, managing her care while Mark has taken advantage of her vulnerability. I won't let him do this anymore. We need to come together to support her, not let one person exploit our family for their own gain. The room was silent, and I could feel the tension hanging in the air. Mark's bravado was fading, and I knew I had struck a nerve. He could no longer hide behind the facade of being the beloved son. The truth was out, and it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. As I finished speaking, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I had finally said what needed to be said, and no matter how Mark reacted, I had taken control of my own narrative. I was ready to cut him out completely from our mother's care if it meant protecting her from further harm. In that moment I realized my strength. I had fought back against the favoritism and manipulation that had dictated our family dynamics for far too long. I was no longer willing to play the role of the dutiful daughter who always cleaned up the mess. I was ready to prioritize my own well-being and ensure that my mother received the care and love she deserved, free from Mark's toxic influence. As the family gathering approached, I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I had gone over every detail in my mind, rehearsing what I would say to Mark, and preparing for the backlash I knew would come. But I also felt a surge of determination that pushed me forward. I was tired of being the one to carry the burden, and I was ready to take a stand. Mark, with his usual charm, was already the center of attention, regaling our relatives with stories that painted him as the loving son, the one who was always there for our mother. Little did they know that behind that facade was a man willing to exploit her illness for his own gain. I could see how easily they bought into his act, and it fueled my resolve to expose him. As the evening unfolded, I watched him closely, noting the way he interacted with the family. He laughed, he joked, and he pretended to care, all while I felt the knot of anger tightening in my stomach. I had to remind myself that this was the moment I had been preparing for. I would not let him manipulate the narrative any longer. Finally, the moment came when our family settled into a lull in conversation. My heart raced as I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I stood up, and every eye in the room turned towards me. This was it. I cleared my throat, ready to reveal the truth. I need to talk to everyone about something serious. Mark, I know what you've been doing. You've been stealing money from Mom's account. Over $5,000. How could you? My voice wavered slightly, but I held my ground. Gasps filled the room as shock washed over the faces of my family members. I could see Mark's expression shift from disbelief to anger. This was the moment I had waited for. A chance to expose the truth. I pressed on. While I've been here, caring for her, managing everything, you've been exploiting her illness for your own gain. This has to stop. The tension was palpable, and I could feel the energy in the room shift. Family members exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by my accusation. Mark, however, was quick to react. He scoffed, trying to regain control of the situation. That's ridiculous, Jess. You're just trying to make me look bad. I can't believe you'd accuse me of that. His anger was a thinly veiled mask for the panic creeping in. I could see it in his eyes, and it gave me strength to continue. You can't deny it, Mark. The bank statements don't lie. You need to be held accountable for your actions. If you don't stop this now, I'll cut you out of our mother's life completely. You won't have any say in her care or finances. You've made it clear that you only care about yourself, and I refuse to let you manipulate this family any longer. The room fell silent as my words hung in the air, and I could sense the disbelief and confusion settling in. I had finally taken a stand, and it felt liberating. I was ready to cut him off for good if it meant protecting my mother. Mark's face was flushed with anger, but I remained steady, determined not to let his rage intimidate me. How could you let this happen? One of our relatives finally spoke up, directing the question at Mark. It was a turning point. The family was starting to question his motives, and I felt a swell of triumph. I had not only exposed him, but I had also pulled back the curtain on our family's toxic dynamics. Mark's bravado began to crumble as family members shifted uncomfortably, no longer willing to blindly support him. I watched as the confusion on their faces morphed into realization. I felt a sense of freedom as the truth began to seep in. I had taken control of my narrative, and I was ready to protect my mother no matter what it took. As the tension in the room intensified, Mark turned his anger towards me, lashing out. You're ruining everything. You're making Mom's illness about you. His words were nothing but an attempt to deflect blame and regain sympathy, but I could see through it now. I stood firm, refusing to let his anger sway me. I had finally broken free from the cycle of manipulation that had dictated our family dynamics for far too long. I met the eyes of my family members, making sure they understood the gravity of what was happening. This isn't just about money. It's about trust and family. We have to protect Mom. I've been here every step of the way, managing her care while Mark has taken advantage of her vulnerability. I won't let him do this anymore. We need to come together to support her, not let one person exploit our family for their own gain. The room was silent, the weight of my words hanging heavy. I could see the realization dawning on their faces. This was a turning point. Mark had lost his grip on the narrative, and I felt a rush of relief wash over me. I had stood my ground, and for the first time I was taking control of my own story. At the family gathering, the tension was thick as I prepared to confront Mark. I had rehearsed my words, knowing this was my chance to expose him for who he truly was. As I entered the room, I could see him across the way, charming everyone with his usual facade. It made my stomach turn, but I was determined to reveal the truth. When the conversation lulled, I seized the moment. I stood up, my heart racing, and cleared my throat. I need to talk to everyone about something serious. Mark, I know what you've been doing. You've been stealing money from Mom's account. Over $5,000. How could you? The gasps from my family echoed in the room, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. Mark's face shifted from confident to shocked, and I pressed on. While I've been caring for her and managing everything, you've been exploiting her illness for your own gain. This has to stop. The atmosphere was electric, and I could see family members exchanging bewildered glances. Mark, however, was quick to dismiss my accusation. That's ridiculous, Jess. You're just trying to make me look bad. He scoffed, his voice shaking. But I was prepared. You can't deny it, Mark. The bank statements don't lie. You need to be held accountable for your actions. If you don't stop this now, I'll cut you out of our mother's life completely. You've made it clear that you only care about yourself, and I refuse to let you manipulate this family any longer. His response was immediate. He looked around the room, searching for support from our family. But instead of sympathy, confusion and disbelief filled their faces. I could feel the tide turning. I had finally taken a stand, and it felt empowering. One relative finally spoke up. How could you let this happen? It was a pivotal moment. They were starting to see Mark for who he really was. I watched as Mark's bravado faltered. The whispers around the room grew louder as family members began to question him. I felt a sense of triumph as the truth began to seep in. No longer was I the one carrying the family burden. I had exposed the deceit that had been hidden for so long. As Mark lashed out, his anger only confirmed his guilt. You're ruining everything. You're making Mom's illness about you. I stood firm, knowing this was his last attempt to regain control. I wouldn't let him drag me back into the chaos. I turned my focus back to the family, ensuring they understood the gravity of the situation. This isn't just about money. It's about trust and family. We have to protect Mom. I've been here managing her care while Mark has taken advantage of her vulnerability. I won't let him exploit our family any longer. The room fell silent, and I could feel the weight of my words hanging in the air. This was a turning point. I had finally taken control of my narrative. Mark's facade was crumbling, and I felt relief wash over me. I had stood my ground, ready to protect my mother and myself from his toxic influence. In that moment, I made a choice that surprised even me. I simply remained silent, letting the tension hang in the air like a thick fog. Instead of rushing to solve the problem, like everyone expected me to, I stepped back and let the chaos unfold. I had always been the peacemaker, the one who tried to smooth things over, but not this time. This time, I was done playing the role of the dutiful daughter who took on all the burdens. This was my moment to reclaim my power. As I stood there, the silence stretched on, and I could feel the eyes of my family on me, waiting for me to react. They were used to me jumping in to save the day, to fix everything, but this time I was resolute. I refused to play into Mark's manipulations, and I wanted everyone to see what he was really made of. The chaos I had been so afraid of was now unfolding around me, and I realized that it was actually liberating. Mark, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, began to panic. He had always thrived on control, and without my immediate response, his carefully crafted facade started to crumble. The guests, who had initially looked on with confusion, began to murmur among themselves, and I could almost hear the gears turning in their heads as they processed what was happening. It was as if a light bulb had gone off for them, illuminating the truth behind Mark's deceit. I watched as Mark's eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but instead of finding it, he was met with stunned expressions and whispers of disbelief. He was losing his grip on the narrative, and the realization was palpable. The more he floundered, the more confident I felt. I had taken a step back to allow the truth to surface, and it was working. Guests began to shift their focus from Mark's desperate attempts to regain control to my calm demeanor. I could see the questions forming in their minds, and I knew that they were starting to connect the dots. My heart raced with anticipation as I let the tension build. Mark's panic was becoming evident. He was struggling to maintain the image he had so meticulously crafted. Eventually, he turned his frustration on me, lashing out with anger that was both expected and revealing. "You're ruining everything. You're making Mom's illness about you," he shouted, his voice rising in pitch. It was the same tired tactic he always used, trying to turn the tables and cast me as the villain. But this time I was having none of it. I held my ground, standing tall and unyielding. I could feel the eyes of my family on me, and I knew they were starting to see through his lies. I let his words wash over me, refusing to engage with his anger. I was no longer the dutiful daughter he could manipulate with guilt. I was taking control of my own narrative, and I felt a sense of validation in that moment. As Mark continued to lash out, I focused on the family members around me, making sure they understood the gravity of the situation. This isn't just about money. It's about trust and family. We have to protect Mom. I've been here every step of the way, managing her care while Mark has taken advantage of her vulnerability. I won't let him do this anymore. We need to come together to support her, not let one person exploit our family for their own gain. The room fell silent again, and I could feel the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. This was a pivotal moment, a turning point where I had finally taken control of my story, and I could see the realization dawning on my family. They were beginning to question Mark's motives, and I felt a swell of pride rising within me. I had not just exposed him. I had also pulled back the curtain on the toxic dynamics that had plagued our family for years. The atmosphere shifted, and I could see that my family was starting to see Mark for who he truly was. The whispers grew louder as they began to murmur amongst themselves, and I felt a rush of triumph. I had finally taken a stand against the favoritism that had defined our relationship for so long. I was done being the one who picked up the pieces while Mark enjoyed the spotlight. Mark's bravado began to crack, and I could see his anger morphing into desperation. He was losing control, and I was finally free from the burden of his expectations. The tension hung in the air, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I had stood firm, refusing to engage further with his manipulative tactics. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around me. I had taken control of my own narrative, and I was ready to protect my mother and myself from Mark's toxic influence. I glanced around the room at the faces of my family, and I could see a mix of confusion, disbelief, and most importantly, understanding. They were beginning to see the truth, and I felt a surge of empowerment. I had finally broken free from the cycle of manipulation, and it was exhilarating. As the situation escalated, Mark turned on me, his voice rising in anger. "You're ruining everything. You're making Mom's illness about you," he yelled, the facade of concern slipping. Instead of remorse, he lashed out, blaming me for the family's turmoil. I stood firm, unyielding. The guests could see through his lies, and whispers of disbelief began to circulate. In that moment I felt a sense of validation. The family's perfect image was cracking, and I was finally free from the burden of their expectations. Mark's reaction wasn't surprising. He had always been a master at deflecting blame, and this was no exception. But this time I wasn't going to let his anger intimidate me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I remained calm. I had spent years being the one to pick up the pieces, the one who always tried to make peace, but today felt different. Today I was done being the scapegoat. "Mark," I said, my voice steady, "this isn't about me. This is about protecting Mom. You've taken advantage of her vulnerability for too long, and I refuse to let you manipulate this family anymore." I could see the anger in his eyes, but I didn't back down. As he continued to shout, I noticed the family members exchanging looks of confusion and disbelief. They were starting to see the cracks in Mark's facade, and I could feel the tide turning in my favor. It was like a weight was being lifted off my shoulders. The truth was finally being revealed. "Why would you do this, Mark?" one of my relatives asked, their voice filled with genuine concern. "How could you let this happen?" The question hung in the air, and I could see Mark's bravado faltering. He was losing the support he had always relied on, and it felt incredible to witness. I took a moment to let his panic sink in, allowing the silence to stretch out as everyone absorbed the gravity of what was happening. Mark was no longer the golden child in this moment. He was the one being scrutinized, and I was finally the one with the truth on my side. In the midst of his anger, Mark tried to regain control, his voice rising even higher. "You're just trying to paint me as the bad guy," he shouted, desperation creeping into his tone. But I could see through his act. He was flailing, and for the first time I wasn't going to jump in and save him. I had spent too long trying to smooth things over, and now it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. Enough, I declared, cutting through the chaos. This isn't about who's a good person or a bad person. This is about our mother. She deserves better than to be used as a pawn in your game. I felt the strength of my words as they echoed in the room. The family was starting to rally around me, their expressions shifting from shock to support. Mark's eyes darted around the room searching for allies. But instead of finding them, he was met with disbelief. I could see the realization dawning on their faces. They were starting to understand that Mark had been manipulating them all along. I felt a rush of triumph as I watched his facade crumble before my eyes. This is the truth, everyone, I continued, my voice unwavering. I've been here every step of the way, caring for Mom while Mark has been exploiting her vulnerability for his own gain. We need to come together as a family and support her, not let one person take advantage of her illness. The murmurs of agreement began to spread among the guests, and I could feel the momentum shifting. Mark was losing control, and for the first time I felt the power that came with standing up for myself and my mother. He was cornered and panicking, and it was exhilarating to witness. As Mark's anger boiled over, he lashed out once more. You're just trying to ruin everything. You're making this about you. His words were nothing more than a desperate attempt to deflect blame, but this time they fell flat. I stood my ground, refusing to let his anger sway me. I had finally broken free from the cycle of manipulation that had dictated our family dynamics for too long. Mark, I said, my voice firm, this isn't about me, it's about our mother. I'm done being the one who carries the burden. I'm done being the one who fixes everything while you take advantage of our family's struggles. I won't let you do this anymore. The room fell silent once more, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. I could sense the shift in the atmosphere. The family members were beginning to see Mark for who he truly was. Their expressions shifted from confusion to understanding, and I felt a swell of pride in my chest. I had taken a stand and I was finally being heard. As Mark continued to sputter, I realized that I was no longer afraid of him or the narrative he had spun for so long. I had exposed the truth and it felt liberating. I was reclaiming my story and my power, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. As Mark's anger continued to escalate, I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. I was ready to protect my mother and myself from his toxic influence. I glanced at my family, and I could see the realization dawning on them. They were beginning to question Mark's motives, and I felt a sense of triumph wash over me. I had finally broken free from the chains of favoritism and manipulation. In that moment, I knew I would no longer be defined by Mark's actions. I was stepping into my own power, ready to forge a new path for myself and my mother. I glanced towards Mark one last time, and as I met his gaze, I felt a sense of satisfaction. The truth was out and I was finally free. With Mark's incompetence fully exposed, I could see how the gravity of the situation was weighing heavily on him. His attempts to deflect blame had failed spectacularly, and now he stood there, visibly shaken, as the family began to turn against him. I felt a surge of triumph as I witnessed the shift in their perception. No longer was he the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. He was now the reckless son who had exploited his mother's illness for personal gain. The truth was unraveling, and I was on the brink of reclaiming my family's narrative. As I looked around the room, I caught snippets of conversations among my relatives. Some were whispering in disbelief, while others were shaking their heads in disappointment. I can't believe Mark would do such a thing, one aunt murmured, her voice filled with shock. I could see her shaking her head in disapproval, and it gave me a sense of validation. Mark's bravado was crumbling before my eyes. He was no longer the confident, charming brother I had grown up with. Instead, he was a desperate man trying to salvage his reputation, and it was beautiful to behold. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had spent years feeling like the outcast, the one left to deal with the fallout of our family's toxic dynamics. But today the truth was surfacing, and I was finally being seen for the one who had been fighting for our mother all along. As the murmurs of disbelief grew louder, I noticed Mark's face contort with anger and panic. He was trapped, and it was exhilarating to witness. "You're all turning against me," he shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. "You don't know the whole story." But the facade he had carefully maintained for so long was crumbling, and I could see that he was losing the support he once had. "What do you mean we don't know the whole story?" Another relative interjected, her eyes narrowing in skepticism. You've been taking money from Mom's account without her consent. That's not okay, Mark. I could see the realization dawning on them, like a slow sunrise breaking the darkness. They were starting to see him for who he truly was, and it was a powerful moment. I took a deep breath and let the silence stretch on for a moment, allowing the weight of the situation to settle over the room. I knew this was my moment to reinforce the truth and protect my mother. Mark, you've manipulated this family for far too long. You've exploited our mother's vulnerability for your own gain, and I refuse to let you do it any longer. We need to come together as a family to support her, not tear each other apart over your greed. Mark's face contorted with rage, and he started to shout again, but I held up my hand to silence him. I wouldn't let him use his anger to intimidate me any longer. The time for silence was over. I was ready to stand my ground. You're the one ruining everything, he yelled, his voice growing hoarse with frustration. You're making this about you, Jessica. But I could see the family's expression shifting from confusion to understanding. They were beginning to question his motives, and I felt a rush of empowerment coursing through me. I knew I had to keep pushing forward. This isn't about me. It's about our mother and her well-being. I've been here taking care of her, fighting for her health, while you've been off living your life taking advantage of her trust. I won't stand for it any longer. The room fell silent once again, and I could feel the weight of my words hanging in the air. They were starting to absorb the truth, and I was finally being heard. As Mark's anger continued to rise, I noticed the family members exchanging glances, a silent agreement passing between them. They were beginning to see through his lies, and I felt a swell of pride within me. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I had finally taken control of my own narrative, and it felt liberating. Mark's frantic attempts to regain control only served to further expose his guilt. He was flailing, and the more he shouted, the more ridiculous he looked. I watched as the guests began to murmur among themselves, and I could sense the tide turning. They were finally questioning his integrity, and it was a beautiful sight. You've taken money from Mom, and you think you can just play the victim? I called out, my voice steady. You've exploited her illness for your own gain. And you're trying to turn this around on me? I won't let you. This is about protecting her. She deserves better than to be used as a pawn in your game. The tension in the room was palpable as I stood my ground. Mark was no longer the favored son. He was the one on the defensive, and I could see the panic in his eyes as he realized he was losing this battle. The family was starting to rally around me, their expressions shifting from shock to solidarity. I had finally broken free from the cycle of manipulation and favoritism, and it felt incredible. As Mark continued to sputter and shout, I could see his facade crumbling. The whispers grew louder, and I could sense the family members leaning in, wanting to know more. They were starting to question everything they thought they knew about him, and I relished the moment. I had taken control of my own story, and I was no longer afraid to speak the truth. Mark, this isn't just about money. It's about trust and family. We can't let one person exploit our mother's vulnerability for their own benefit. I've been here every step of the way, and I refuse to let you manipulate this family any longer. I felt the strength of my words echoing in the room. I had finally taken a stand, and it felt empowering. In that moment, I knew I had not just exposed Mark's deceit. I had also reclaimed my power. I had shown the family that I was not the villain in this story. I was the one fighting for what was right. I had finally broken free from the chains of favoritism and manipulation, and it was exhilarating. As I stood there watching Mark's world unravel around him, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I had fought for my mother, and in doing so I had discovered my own strength. I was no longer defined by Mark's actions or the toxic family dynamics that had plagued us for so long. I was reclaiming my narrative and embracing my independence, ready to forge a new path for myself and my mother. As I took control of my mother's finances and ensured she received the best care possible, I found a profound sense of peace. Mark was cut off completely, and I no longer felt the weight of his expectations or manipulation. While he continued to play the victim to anyone who would listen, I focused on creating a life for myself outside of the toxic family dynamic. I had learned to prioritize my own well-being, and it felt incredible. I spent the following months organizing my mother's medical appointments, and managing her finances with clarity and confidence. I even hired a financial advisor to help navigate the complexities of her care, ensuring that every penny was accounted for. It was liberating to do this on my own terms, free from Mark's influence. I felt empowered, and in that empowerment, I discovered a new side of myself. The victory was not just in caring for my mother. It was in my newfound independence. I began to set boundaries with other family members who tried to sway me back into the fold of favoring Mark. They could no longer pull me into their drama. I learned to say no. And oh, how freeing that was. One evening, as I sat on my balcony sipping wine, I glanced at my phone as it buzzed with a message from Mark. It was another one of his attempts to reach out, perhaps to manipulate me into feeling guilty for cutting him off. But this time I simply ignored it, content in my silence. I had reclaimed my peace, and nothing could take that away from me.